Title: The Thirst Below. It rained for 7 days in Warwick. Not water, not snow, but something black and warm like oil laced with iron. It clung to skin, soaked into graves, and left a bitter taste in the air. By the third night, animals stopped making sounds. By the fourth, the mirrors no longer reflected right. And by the fifth, the first throat was found torn out. No blood spilled, no signs of struggle. Just a look of peace frozen on the corpse's face. At the edge of town stood a chapel long abandoned. Its bell rang for the first time in decades, though the rope had rotted away. Inside, beneath the altar, something stirred. A coffin wrapped in chains. Symbols carved into its lid, long worn smooth by time. The sixth night, the coffin opened itself, and the thing inside breathed its first stolen breath. It had no eyes, no heart, just a hunger that had waited centuries beneath the soil, whispering through the earth to the weak, the lost, the grieving. The black rain had been its invitation, and Warwick had answered. The town didn't know it yet, but they were already changing. By the seventh night, the black rain had stopped, but its mark remained. The streets glistened with a layer of oil-like residue. The air was thick with a scent of decay, but no one could pinpoint where it came from. It was as if the entire town was suffocating in a graveyard of its own making. The first to feel it were the children. They were the first to stop speaking. At first, they just stared at the adults, blankly, like they were listening to something no one else could hear. Then their smiles faded. Eyes became pools of darkness. A child's laugh, once bright, became a hollow echo in their throats. Old Mrs. Harper, the town's caretaker, noticed it when she went to check on young Abigail. The girl had been locked in her room for days, refusing food, refusing water. When Mrs. Harper opened the door, the room was colder than it should have been. Windows shut tight against the night air, no wind. Abigail was standing in front of the mirror, her back to the window. Her skin was pale, veins running dark beneath it like they were trying to crawl out. Her lips were cracked, her hair hanging in tangles. But it was her eyes, those eyes, that made Mrs. Harper freeze. They were no longer human. They were hollow, endless, like they reached into the very pit of the earth. "You shouldn't have come," Abigail whispered, her voice raspy, unnatural. Mrs. Harper felt her heart stutter. What happened to you, child?" Abigail didn't respond. She simply smiled, a smile full of too many teeth, too wide, too sharp. The room grew colder. Mrs. Harper's breath misted in the air. And then, for the first time, Abigail turned to face her. But it wasn't just Abigail. A figure stood behind her, cloaked in black, its skin impossibly white. Thin lips curled into a grin that shouldn't have been possible. The thing wasn't just in the room, it was inside Abigail, filling her skin with its shadow. The mirror behind them shimmered. The figure in the reflection was not Abigail, but something far older, far hungrier. Mrs. Harper stumbled back, her feet catching the edge of the doorframe, but she couldn't look away. The thing in the mirror, it saw her. And that was when the black rain returned, but this time it was inside her, filling her lungs with something cold and sharp like broken glass. Or it could no longer remember what it had been like before the rain. The townsfolk walked the streets like sleepwalkers, eyes glazed, mouths barely moving. Their minds were fractured, pieces of memories falling away, as if something was siphoning away their very selves. And the hunger. It had started as whispers in the dead of night, low murmurs, too quiet to understand but loud enough to feel. It crawled through the streets like smoke. No one spoke about it, but everyone knew. And then came the dreams. The dreams that pulled at the heartstrings of the town. People woke from them with blood in their mouths, hands trembling, filled with the burning need to do something, anything, to end the gnawing, consuming ache. They called it the thirst. Sarah McAllister was one of the first to succumb. She had been a nurse in the town for over 20 years, practical and steady, unaffected by the weirdness that had begun to spread. But one evening, as the sun sank into the blood-red horizon, Sarah felt the heat rise within her chest, a sharp pain that dug in deep. Her throat burned like fire, and her fingers trembled uncontrollably. She ignored it, thinking it was just exhaustion. But when she reached the window to close the blinds, she saw him, the pale figure, standing in the field just outside her house. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. But as the figure stepped forward, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the pale king. His white skin shimmered in the dying light, almost translucent, like a thing of death itself. His eyes, black as the pit of a soul, were locked onto her, and as he moved closer, she felt her heart slow. Then, like the air before a storm, a whisper passed through her. "Come." She tried to scream. She tried to run. But her feet wouldn't move. Her mouth wouldn't open. The hunger surged inside her, overwhelming her. In an instant, Sarah's hands were at her neck, clawing at her own skin as though trying to tear it off. Blood flowed freely, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Her reflection in the window, the reflection that wasn't hers, showed her face twisted in a grotesque grin, eyes shining with the same void as his. By dawn, Sarah was gone, and in her place, something darker remained. Her body had been emptied, hollowed out like a vessel. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now two dark pits, endless and bottomless. And the thirst had only just begun. By the fifth day, no one in Warwick was truly awake anymore. They moved in strange, disjointed ways, like puppets with broken strings. Eyes glazed over, their lips rarely parted, except when they whispered softly the same words over and over. He calls. The town no longer slept. Instead, they wandered through the streets, haunted by the sound of the Pale King's voice, a low murmur that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The wind carried it in whispers, the trees echoed it, the walls of the houses seemed to hum with it. And in the dead of night, something else began to shift. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the living, and cracks began to appear in the earth, splitting open like a wound that had never healed. From these fissures came the smell of rot and decay, mingling with the iron stench of the black rain that had long since soaked into the land. It wasn't just the rain that had changed the soil. It was the hunger. It had awakened, and it had begun to spread. Sarah McAllister's body was found in the town cemetery on the sixth day, only it wasn't her. Not anymore. What had once been Sarah had been hollowed out, like a vessel drained of its essence, her skin pulled tight over her bones. Her hands were clawed, her mouth gaping wide as if trying to scream, but no sound came. Her eyes had been replaced by black pits of liquid darkness, like something crawling inside them, fighting to get out. The townspeople found her, and in their broken minds, they could no longer distinguish her from the Pale King. They didn't think. They didn't even try. They tore into her flesh, hands clawing, teeth sinking into her neck and chest. And it felt good. Felt right. The hunger spread through them in an instant. Blood became thicker, their minds sharper, and the pain, it went away. Their eyes, once filled with dull fear, now gleamed with a sick, hungry light. They devoured her. Every last drop. But as Sarah's body was reduced to nothing more than a pile of lifeless meat, they knew something had changed again. The Pale King had moved. He had called to them, and they had answered. They moved in strange, disjointed ways, like puppets with broken strings. Eyes glazed over, their lips rarely parted, except when they whispered softly the same words over and over. He calls. The town no longer slept. Instead, they wandered through the streets, haunted by the sound of the Pale King's voice, a low murmur that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The wind carried it in whispers, the trees echoed it, the walls of the houses seemed to hum with it. And in the dead of night, something else began to shift. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the living, and cracks began to appear in the earth, splitting open like a wound that had never healed. From these fissures came the smell of rot and decay, mingling with the iron stench of the black rain that had long since soaked into the land. It wasn't just the rain that had changed the soil. It was the hunger. It had awakened, and it had begun to spread. Sarah McAllister's body was found in the town cemetery on the sixth day, only it wasn't her. Not anymore. What had once been Sarah had been hollowed out, like a vessel drained of its essence, her skin pulled tight over her bones. Her hands were clawed, her mouth gaping wide as if trying to scream, but no sound came. Her eyes had been replaced by black pits of liquid darkness, like something crawling inside them, fighting to get out. The townspeople found her, and in their broken minds, they could no longer distinguish her from the Pale King. They didn't think. They didn't even try. They tore into her flesh, hands clawing, teeth sinking into her neck and chest. And it felt good. Felt right. The hunger spread through them in an instant. Blood became thicker, their minds sharper, and the pain, it went away. Their eyes, once filled with dull fear, now gleamed with a sick, hungry light. They devoured her. Every last drop. But as Sarah's body was reduced to nothing more than a pile of lifeless meat, they knew something had changed again. The Pale King had moved. He had called to them, and they had answered. There was no escape. Warwick had been slowly suffocated by the hunger. Its presence permeated the town like a disease, consuming every thought, every action. And now, even the few who hadn't yet succumbed to it, those who clung to their sanity with the last vestiges of will, felt it gnawing at them. The hunger was in their bones. It had gotten under their skin. In the church, the few remaining survivors gathered, whispering in prayer, but their words came out wrong. They no longer spoke to God. No, they spoke to him. The Pale King. Father Owen had tried to stop it. He had resisted the call longer than most, but even his mind had begun to fray. He could feel the tendrils of the hunger creeping inside him, his thoughts becoming foggy, his hands trembling with the need to feed. But he wasn't alone. There were others with him. Ellen Grayson, the town's midwife, had been one of the first to realize what was happening. She hadn't eaten in days, but the hunger still clawed at her throat, demanding to be satisfied. Her once warm, motherly eyes were now dead, blackened pits. She had no strength to fight the thirst, and yet, she still tried. Ellen approached Father Owen, her lips pulling back in a grimace that barely resembled a smile. "We can't stop it, Father," she whispered, voice strained. "It's inside us all. It's too late." Father Owen stepped back, his hands trembling as he clutched the cross around his neck. The thing that had once been Ellen seemed to tower over him, her face too pale, too still. But her eyes, those empty, dark pits, stared at him, and for the first time he saw something else there. The Pale King was in her. He had always been inside her. He had always been inside them all. A voice, not Ellen's but something older, deeper, rasped from her throat. "You are too weak to fight." The hunger surged again. Father Owen's breath caught in his chest. He could feel it. It was crawling slowly through his veins. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, but it wasn't air anymore. It was blood. Thick, hot, suffocating blood that filled his lungs and burned his throat. Ellen, or what was left of her, stepped forward. She was no longer human. It had claimed her body and soul. With a final, guttural sound, she tore into his throat. The scream never left Father Owen's lips. The night felt wrong. The town of Warwick had become a place of nightmares, a landscape where the sun no longer seemed to rise with warmth, and the moon hung like a dead eye, watching from above. The black rain had stopped, but the scars it left behind never healed. The land itself seemed to writhe, twisting and shifting beneath the feet of the living. There were no more prayers, no more resistance. The survivors had all given in, one by one, until the hunger had claimed them all. And those who hadn't succumbed fully to the thirst were no longer people. They were husks, empty, wandering things. A few of the children were left, thin, skeletal figures with eyes that no longer held any innocence. They wandered the streets, staring at the walls, at the ground, at nothing at all. Their hands were twitching, trembling with the same hunger that had consumed everyone else. But they did not speak. They did not cry. They only waited. Then, as the silence stretched on, the earth itself screamed. Beneath the very ground where the orchard once stood, beneath the rotting remains of what had been Warwick, the earth cracked open, wide enough to swallow whole houses, whole streets. From the gaping fissures, shapes began to emerge. Dark, twisted things that slithered like worms, their bodies made of darkness, their forms shifting like liquid shadows. The first of the Pale King's children had risen. They were not human, nor were they anything else that could be named. Their bodies were pulled from the very soil that had soaked up the blood, molded by hunger and fury. Their eyes were pits of void, devoid of any soul, and their mouths hung open, far too wide, filled with jagged teeth that scraped together like metal scraping stone. And they were hungry. The townspeople, or what was left of them, had gathered in the square, their bodies sagging from hunger, their eyes glassy, but still waiting. Their thoughts had faded away, there was only the thirst. The king had called. They could not ignore. And then the children began to scream. The wails split the air, a horrific sound that echoed through the hills, vibrating in the bones of the living and the dead alike. It was the sound of something being pulled from the depths of the earth, an ancient hunger that no mortal body could satisfy. They came from the ground, like maggots rising from the carcass of a slaughtered beast. The Pale King's children. They tore into the living and the dead with vicious abandon. Their mouths opened wide, swallowing flesh, bone, and soul with ease. No one was spared. No one was left to die in peace. As the town's last screams were smothered beneath the sound of gnashing teeth, the earth began to close again, as if swallowing every trace of what had been. The figures were gone. The hunger had taken all it needed. The blood had been spilled, the souls consumed. The last of the survivors, those who still had enough humanity left to think, watched in horror, knowing that no matter how far they ran, they could never escape it. The Pale King's hunger was eternal, and Warwick was just the Warwick was no longer a town. It was a scar, a dark stain that bled into the earth, stretching out like an open wound, waiting for more to fall in. There was no life left in the soil, no air that could be breathed without tasting the blood that had soaked into the ground. The last of the survivors, those who had hidden, trembling in basements and forgotten corners of their homes, felt the hunger grow stronger with every passing hour. They could still hear it. The whispers, the echoes. It was as if the town itself was alive, alive in a way that no living thing should be. Every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind, every crack of thunder spoke to them. They could hear the Pale King calling. He was everywhere. He was in the earth, in the air, in their bones. And the hunger had begun to gnaw at the very edges of their minds. Elliot James had been the last to hold out. The town's butcher. He had hidden in his shop, the thick wooden doors barricaded, the windows covered in filthy cloths. He could hear the sounds outside, scraping, gnashing, tearing, but he kept his back to the wall. His knife was always within reach. But Elliot had no illusions anymore. He had heard the stories of the Pale King, of the creatures who rose from the soil, the hunger that could not be sated, the endless cycle of bloodshed. And he knew now, with absolute certainty, that he was being watched. He could feel the eyes on him even through the darkness. And then one night the door burst open. There was no wind, no warning, just the violent crash of wood splintering. Elliot grabbed his cleaver instinctively, but it was too late. A face, pale, smooth, with features that seemed to melt into each other, appeared in the doorway. Its eyes were hollow, two black voids that stared into him, through him. And its smile stretched too wide, too jagged, like the grin of a thing that had never known joy, but only hunger. The creature stepped inside. Elliot didn't fight. He couldn't. His legs felt like stone, his breath choking in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The air thickened, pressing in on him as if the very room was folding in on itself. The creature didn't move. It simply watched, and Elliot could feel his strength draining away, like the life was being pulled from his body. The hunger seeped into his skin, into his bones, filling him with a terrible emptiness that swallowed everything whole. It was the thirst. The creature moved toward him, its mouth opening wider than any mouth should have. Its teeth, long, sharp, and glistening with saliva, clicked together as it loomed over him. And then, with one final crushing motion, it bit into his throat. Elliot's vision blurred, the darkness spreading like ink across his mind. His last thought was of the hunger, the endless, insatiable hunger. And then there was not it slithered beneath the skin of the land, pooling in every shadow, weaving through every crack and crevice. No one knew how it spread so quickly, how it moved so silently, but it had left nothing untouched. Warwick was gone, its bones picked clean by the things that had risen from the soil. And now, the hunger had begun to creep outward, slowly, methodically, reaching toward the neighboring towns, toward the forgotten places that had not yet felt the touch of the Pale King. In the nearby village of Issenbrook, the first signs appeared on the sixth night. At first, it was subtle. A few missing animals, strange stains on the dirt paths, a rustling in the woods. But as the days passed, the signs grew more unmistakable. A child was found in the river, her eyes wide open, staring up at the sky with a blankness that made the villagers' hearts freeze in their chests. No blood was spilled. No wounds visible. Just the stillness of death. The next morning, the first body was found in the town square. A man named Tobias Green. His flesh was still warm to the touch, his lips locked in an expression of pain. His heart had been torn out, ripped from his chest as if by claws too large to belong to anything human. But it wasn't just the violence that shocked the villagers, it was the fact that there was no blood. None. Just pale, empty skin, like the very life had been sucked out of him, and there was nothing left but a hollow shell. Issenbrook was the first to fall. It didn't take long before the rest of the village followed. The hunger spread like wildfire, devouring everything in its path. People began to change. Their eyes turned dark and the twitching began, an involuntary movement, a hunger that thrummed beneath their flesh, clawing to get out. They stopped speaking. They stopped thinking. They became vessels. One by one, they tore into the town's population, feasting like animals, tearing through flesh, bone, and marrow until there was nothing left but the empty, hollow shells of the once living. It was the Pale King's doing, the hunger taking root in their hearts, in their veins. The ones who had once been human had become part of the king's harvest. They were no longer living. They were no longer even dead. The survivors, those who fled from Issenbrook and the nearby towns, thought they had escaped the worst of it. They thought they could outrun the hunger, the shadows that had claimed their homes and families. But there was nowhere left to run. The hunger moved like a tide, slow, unstoppable, and relentless. Everywhere it went, it left a trail of emptiness. The land became barren, the trees withered, and the animals disappeared. But it wasn't just the land that was changing. The survivors began to change too. In the last bastion of human resistance, a small cluster of refugees had taken refuge in an old abbey. Its high stone walls, ancient and weathered, stood like a forgotten monument to a world that no longer existed. Inside they prayed. They prayed for salvation. They prayed for a way out. But the hunger had already found them. One by one, the refugees began to disappear. It wasn't the creatures that got to them first. It wasn't the monsters that rose from the ground with their jagged teeth and black eyes. No, it was the hunger itself that came for them, creeping into their hearts, their minds, until they no longer knew who they were. It started with quiet whispers, soft murmurs in the dark corners of the abbey. At first, no one noticed. They were too exhausted, too fearful of the things outside to think much of the strange sounds. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. And then came the laughter. The laughter echoed through the halls of the abbey, bouncing off the stone walls, filling every shadow with something darker, something deeper. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was the sound of madness, the sound of hunger. Then the first body was found. Sister Miriam had been the abbey's healer, the last to hold on to her faith. But when they found her, her eyes were gone, ripped out as though something had reached into her skull and torn them free. Her mouth was wide open in a silent scream, her chest ripped open as if something had crawled inside her and eaten its way out. But there was no blood, only emptiness. The others gathered around, trembling in fear, but they couldn't stop themselves. The hunger gnawed at their bellies, at their minds, at their very souls. They could feel it spreading through their veins, demanding release. The abbey was sealed off, the doors locked tight, but it was too late. They were already inside. And the Pale King's influence had already begun to twist them from the inside out. By the time the last of the survivors gathered in the chapel, there was nothing left of their humanity. The hunger had consumed them. They were no longer people. They were vessels, hungry, desperate, broken. They began to tear into each other. The first scream rang out in the dead of night, and it didn't stop. It echoed through the abbey, through the hills, and beyond. It was the sound of the last breath of humanity swallowed by the hunger. As the last survivors fell to their knees, drained of life, the sky above the abbey darkened. A shadow passed over the moon, casting the world in total darkness. And in that silence, the Pale King's voice rose, a low, rumbling whisper that filled the air. The harvest is not yet finished. Once the land had been full of life. The fields had stretched wide with golden crops. The forests had echoed with the cries of birds, and the air had been filled with the scent of earth and rain. Now there was nothing. No life. No sound but the whispers of hunger that moved through the stillness like a breeze. In the distance, the last remnants of humanity gathered. They were the few survivors, those who had not yet succumbed to the thirst or the call of the Pale King. They had fled the towns, the villages, the abbeys that had been swallowed whole. But even in their isolated refuge, they could hear the whispers. It was coming for them. The small settlement had found a semblance of peace, hiding in the remnants of a once thriving village. They were too far from the heart of the hunger, too far to hear the screams from Issenbrook, from Warwick, from the abbeys. But the pale, sickening sky told them that no place would be untouched. Among the survivors was Lila Turner, a woman whose face had been carved by the years of terror. Her eyes were sunken, her body gaunt, but her mind was sharp, sharper than any of the others who huddled close to the flickering fire, too afraid to sleep. Lila had seen it, the way the land had shifted, the way the creatures had crawled from the earth. She knew the truth of it now, though no one else would listen. The Pale King was not a man. He was not a god. He was hunger itself, and it was growing stronger. The villagers tried to ignore the unease that spread like a sickness through their bones. They went about their daily lives, whispering prayers that fell on deaf ears, lighting candles that did little to hold the darkness at bay. But the hunger was patient. It didn't need to rush. Lila had witnessed the darkness closing in on the others before. She had seen their eyes turn black, their hands twitch and grasp at the empty air as if someone, was pulling them toward the abyss. They could never escape it, and soon she knew it would come for her. But she couldn't just sit and wait for it to consume her like all the others. She had to do something. She had to find out what it was, this hunger, this thing that had claimed their world. On the eve of the 10th night, Lila ventured into the woods. The trees stood like giants, silent, watchful, ancient. She had seen them in her dreams, twisted, gnarled, bent to the will of the Pale King. The land was his and it was dying. But she knew that somewhere, deep in the forest, she would find the answers. She could feel them pulling her closer, just beyond the veil of shadows. The air grew cold as she moved deeper into the forest, the leaves rustling like whispers on the wind. It wasn't long before she found what she was searching for, an old stone altar, half buried beneath the twisted roots of an ancient oak tree. It was covered in moss and blood-red stains. She didn't need to see the markings on it to know what it was. This was where it had all started. The hunger. The altar was alive. As Lila approached, a low, guttural voice filled her mind, the sound like the scraping of bone against bone. It was the voice of the Pale King. "You have come. You have always come." Her heart stopped. She could feel it, his presence reaching out to her from the very earth beneath her feet, from the roots that dug deep into the soil. She had never truly understood it before, but now she did. The hunger had always been there. It was ancient, primal, and it could never be satiated. The altar shifted, groaning under the weight of something unseen, something terrible. The earth trembled, and the sky above darkened as a shadow fell over the forest. Lila fell to her knees, her hands pressing against the cold stone, and as she did, the whisper of the Pale King surrounded her, filling her mind. "You cannot escape me." And then, from the earth, something reached up, long twisted fingers, blackened and covered in writhing veins. They wrapped around her wrist, pulling her toward the altar. She tried to scream, but the hunger had already filled her mouth, her lungs, her soul. There was nothing left to fight with. The hunger had come for her. It was always coming. And now it was here. The moment her fingers touched the stone altar, the world around her dissolved into a sea of darkness. It was not the kind of darkness that came with nightfall, nor was it the kind of shadow that wrapped itself around you with the cold embrace of fear. This was a deeper darkness, the kind that existed long before the sun rose, a void that was waiting patiently for everything to be undone. As she was dragged beneath the altar, Lila's mind fractured. The ground beneath her buckled, the very soil alive with hunger. She could feel the pulse of it, a throbbing, relentless thing that stretched across the land, crawling into the air, into her lungs. It was everywhere, and it was starving. She could hear the voice again, the Pale King's voice, distant but close, a low, thunderous rumble that resonated deep within her bones. "You think you are free. You think you can escape." Lila tried to break free, but the fingers that held her wrist were not made of flesh. They were made of the earth itself, long, twisted roots that burrowed into her skin, into her veins. The more she struggled, the tighter they gripped her, dragging her toward the abyss that waited beneath the altar. The very air grew thick, suffocating, the ground beneath her feet crumbling away, as if the world itself was falling apart. She gasped, her vision blurring, and just as the roots pulled her further down, a sudden clarity struck her. A vision, a glimpse into something ancient and terrible. She saw it then, the truth she had been searching for. The hunger was not simply a curse. It was not a plague nor a disease. It was a revelation. The Pale King had not always been the thing that rose from the depths of the earth. No, he had once been human, a man who had walked among the living long before the first dawn. His hunger had not started as a curse. It had started as a desire for power, for immortality. But immortality came at a price. And in his quest to conquer death, the Pale King had given himself to the hunger. He had bound his soul to the very land he had sought to rule, and in doing so, he became the embodiment of the thirst, the endless, insatiable craving that could never be satisfied. And now the hunger had spread. It was not just the Pale King who had been twisted by this hunger. The land itself, the very earth, had become a vessel for it. It was a cycle, a never-ending loop of life and death, of blood and bone, feeding upon itself. The Pale King was not the only one who had been consumed. Every town, every village, every soul that had been lost to the hunger had become part of it. They were not dead. They were not alive. They were vessels. Lila's mind cracked open with the weight of this revelation. She understood now. The hunger was not something that could be killed. It could only be fed. And there was no escape. The roots around her tightened, their grip now consuming her entirely. She could feel the hunger sink into her veins, crawling beneath her skin, tearing at her soul. The air thickened until she could no longer breathe, and the last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the pale face of the Pale King. It was his face, but it wasn't. It was the face of everyone who had ever succumbed to the hunger. His eyes were hollow, empty voids, but they burned with an eternal, unyielding fire. "You are mine," he whispered, and with that Lila was gone. The ground trembled, a distant quake that seemed to come from the very heart of the world. The survivors, those few who had not yet fallen to the thirst or the Pale King's touch, felt it in their bones. They were scattered now, divided, each hiding in their own corners of the world, desperately clinging to life. But hope had become a fleeting thing. In the village of Asheville, a once thriving town on the edge of a crumbling forest, the last few survivors gathered in secret. They were a broken people, each carrying the weight of the death they had witnessed, the family members they had lost, the lives they had failed to save. The hunger had already spread through the neighboring towns, consuming everything in its wake, but Asheville had managed to stay untouched, so far. Lydia Devereux was the last of the town's healers, and she had seen too much. She had seen the bodies piled in the streets, the eyes gone black, the flesh withered and hollow. But she had also seen something else, something that gnawed at her sanity and threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. It was in the woods. The creatures, no longer human yet not fully beasts, had begun to appear in the forest. They were the hollowed ones, the twisted remnants of those who had once been human, but who had been consumed by the hunger. They had no faces, no true features, only dark, sunken eyes and skeletal, shriveled skin. Their mouths were wide, gaping holes where teeth once were, and their limbs were long and twisted, like shadows given form. The hollowed ones were the Pale King's army, the first stage of the transformation, the ones who would walk the earth until the hunger had consumed all that was left. They were the heralds, the forerunners, the ones who brought death with every step. Lydia had seen one up close. She had gone into the forest to gather herbs, knowing that they would need them in the coming weeks, as the fever had begun to claim more lives in Asheville. But when she ventured too deep into the woods, she came upon a clearing that had once been peaceful, a place where the villagers would gather during festivals, now marred by a grotesque display. The hollowed one had been standing at the edge of the clearing, unmoving, its body contorted at odd angles, as if it were not entirely solid. Its eyes locked onto Lydia, and she could feel its presence in her chest, a weight that pushed her down until she could barely breathe. It opened its mouth, the gaping hole that was once a mouth, and Lydia's mind was filled with a sound. No, not a sound, but a feeling. It was the hunger pressing against her, pushing into her thoughts. "Come," the hollowed one whispered, though its lips never moved. "Come and be filled. Come and join the feast. There is nothing left but us." Lydia turned and ran, her breath ragged as she stumbled through the underbrush. The hollowed one didn't follow, but its presence lingered, like a dark stain on the air. When she returned to the village, the signs were already there. The hollowed ones had begun to gather on the outskirts of Asheville, their movements erratic and unnatural. They had found them. The villagers were already preparing to flee, but Lydia knew that it was only a matter of time before the hollowed ones would breach the town. They would not stop, not until every last one of them had been consumed. And worse, she realized with a sinking heart, there was no escape from the hunger. The hollowed ones weren't just a warning. They were the beginning. The Pale King's army was marching forward, and nothing would stand in its way. Lydia had one choice left. She had heard the whispers, the tales of a place where the Pale King could be stopped. A forgotten temple, deep in the mountains, where it was said that the hunger could be purged, if one could find it. But it was only a legend, a myth. No one had ever returned from the journey. But it was the only hope left. With a heavy heart, Lydia made her decision. She would go. She would risk everything to find this temple, if it even existed. The hollowed ones were already close, and the hunger was spreading with every passing hour. The sun set on Asheville, casting long shadows across the dying town, and Lydia knew that she had already made her choice. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. The Pale King would come. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to fight back. As Lydia stepped away from the dying village of Asheville, the eerie quiet that had overtaken the land wrapped itself around her like a shroud. The pale light of the dying sun cast long shadows across the broken earth, and the forest that had once felt alive now seemed hollow, its trees like twisted specters reaching toward the heavens. She knew that time was running out. The hollowed ones were too close, and the hunger was spreading like wildfire. Every step she took away from the village felt like a step further into a void, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. The journey to find the fabled temple of the Pale King was not one Lydia had ever thought she would embark on. But now it was the only chance left, the only shred of hope. The path was treacherous. The dense woods grew thicker as she ventured deeper, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. There was no sound of birds or animals. Only the wind, rustling through the dry leaves, carried the faintest whispers, whispers she had learned to fear. The hunger was close. It was always close. She could feel it in her skin, in her bones, as if it were trailing her, watching her every movement. The first night, Lydia camped in the woods, a small fire barely enough to keep the darkness at bay. She had no map, no guide, only the tales passed down in hushed voices, stories of an ancient place hidden deep in the mountains, where the hunger could be silenced forever, where the Pale King could be stopped. But those were only stories. Lydia didn't know what she was walking into. But she knew she had no choice. The hunger would consume them all if she didn't find it. By the second day, the air had grown thick with a pungent, metallic scent. Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She didn't look back. There was no need. She had seen enough to know the horrors that lurked in the shadows. The hollowed ones were relentless, but they were not her true enemy. The Pale King was. That night, as she trudged through the dense underbrush, she stumbled upon a clearing, and there, standing like an unnatural monument, was the entrance to the temple. It was not what she had expected. The structure was massive, a jagged, black stone edifice that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. It rose like a mountain, its surface covered in strange, glowing symbols, like veins of light pulsing in the dark. The entrance was flanked by towering statues, figures carved from obsidian, their faces frozen in a silent, mocking grin. Lydia hesitated for a moment, the gravity of what lay before her sinking in. This was it, the place where it all began, the heart of the hunger. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, the ancient doors creaking open with a groan that echoed through the silence. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin crawl. The temple was a labyrinth. Endless corridors twisted in on themselves, each one darker than the last, filled with the distant echo of something breathing, something watching. The further she went, the more oppressive the darkness became. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if the very space around her was alive, suffocating her, pulling at her thoughts, making it harder to remember why she had come. The hunger was here, and it was waiting for her. She pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as she navigated the winding passages. And then she came upon a vast chamber. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the floor was slick with a black, viscous liquid that glimmered faintly in the dim light. At the far end of the chamber, a massive stone throne sat atop a dais, its surface carved with intricate symbols of power and despair. And upon that throne, seated in a pool of shadow and light, was the Pale King. His form was not human. Not entirely. He sat unnaturally still, his pale skin stretched tight across his bones, his eyes black and empty. His face was gaunt, his lips cracked and dry, but when his gaze met hers, she felt it, an overwhelming sense of hunger, of emptiness, that threatened to consume her very soul. "You have come," he said, his voice low, deep, resonating through the chamber like a living thing. "You think you can stop it, but you cannot. The hunger is part of me, and I am part of it." Lydia stood frozen, her limbs trembling with fear, but she forced herself to take a step forward. "There has to be a way to end it," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast chamber. "There has to be a way to stop the hunger." The Pale King's lips twisted into a smile, a cruel, mocking smile that sent a chill racing down Lydia's spine. "There is no ending it. There is no stopping what has already begun." His gaze softened, almost pitying, and for a moment, Lydia saw something in him. Something that reminded her of the man he once was, long before the hunger consumed him. "But you are different. You do not belong here." Before she could respond, the ground beneath her trembled and a low, guttural growl filled the chamber. From the darkness, something began to stir, something ancient and monstrous, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Lydia backed away, the realization dawning on her with horrible clarity. She was not alone. The Pale King's throne dissolved behind. Don't forget to like and subscribe and watch out for the next.